So in preparing for sharing with you today, I kept thinking about the title of this conference. And I did want to provide a bit of a historical perspective on virtual patients and virtual scenarios, and realize that it was a series of choices that kind of led me here and led us to develop this type of software and this approach to teaching. And why not use the scenario-based software that we developed in order to demonstrate that? So this is JB McGee's Yellow Brick Road or intended path. It may be a little bit hard to see the individual titles on these, but this is the actual virtual patient software that Terry just spoke of. And it consists of a bunch of nodes and branches. And if I was to do everything the way I had planned and the way that my parents probably intended me to do, I would have gone to college, gone to medical school, done a medical residency, do specialty training in gastroenterology, become a private practice gastroenterologist, which in the States is a fairly lucrative and successful way for your child to spend his career. And then probably around this point in my life have a midlife crisis, buy a sports car or run off with a younger woman or something. And as all good gastroenterologists do, retire to Florida. Didn't quite happen that way. And the branch points and the decision points had an effect on life. The biggest one, as I reflected on how we got here, was that I wasn't accepted to medical school first round. I have to admit I'm not the strongest student, and I had a year off between finishing college and starting medical school, hopefully. And so, kind of similar to a gap year you might call here, I had to spend my time doing something. There was this new opportunity to purchase personal computers at a lower price, and decided to teach myself how to write programming and how to build software applications. Now, all I could afford was the Commodore 64. How many people in this room even recognize this device? Okay, and you can keep your hands up because I'm going to ask how many people are over 50 years old. So only those that are either super computer geeks or mature are going to recognize. You can put your arms down now. Just a little exercise to keep you awake. So I bought one of these and taught myself the basic programming language and taught myself how to kind of make things bounce around on the screen and was thinking of it more as a diversion and a hobby than something that could become a career. That thankfully I did get accepted to medical school the following year, and early on in medical school decided to actually do my first entrepreneurial activity, and myself and a good friend decided to start a note-taking service where we would transcribe what the lecturers were saying and distribute that to the students the next morning in their mailbox. So I had the computer, he bought a copy machine, and we charged a nominal amount. And what that nominal amount enabled me to do was buy a new computer. And this, I think, was an early catalyst to associate entrepreneurial activity, academic activity, and buys you new and better computers. And perhaps that's my entire career, has been motivated to find new ways of developing technology and have brighter and flashier toys. So this is the Commodore 128 with double the memory of the Commodore 64, which was a dramatic improvement. Now, just to put things in perspective, the difference between the computers then and now, I think I did my math right, but we had 120 kilobytes of memory in some of the early Macs and the Commodore, and that now is 8 billion kilobytes of memory in current computers. But going back to the branching narrative that I'm constructing here, after getting into medical school, got into a medical residency, and was identified as one of the few people that actually owned a personal computer at that time. This was the early 90s. And one of still a mentor of mine, Steve Sandroni, approached me and said, well, I think I can get us a grant to buy another computer and see if we can figure out a way to use it in medical education. And seriously, we wrote a grant that said perhaps computers could be used to enhance education. Maybe they're not just for accounting and keeping track of medical records. So we embedded a early Mac computer on the medical floors, put a few little training programs on that. He's a nephrologist, so we had a lot of little animated and illustrated lessons that the residents and the medical students could interact with while they were on the wards and kind of in the context of taking care of patients. And so we published our first paper and presented at our first conference. And I want you to notice the title. It's called Reducing Cost in Resident Education. And to this day, I think a lot of us use reduction in cost as a motivation to develop technology. And I have yet to see any true reduction in cost using any of our software applications, but perhaps more correctly, we have enhanced the quality of learning. It still takes some time, takes some effort, and takes some costs, but this was presented at one of the national informatics conferences and kind of got the ball rolling. So we did a number of papers and experiments, and the availability of computers obviously became much more widespread, and as the internet evolved, became easier to distribute these educational materials. But I got back on track and went into my specialty training and applied for more grants. We got better computers, developed more training programs, still not quite to the virtual patient stage. And then was invited to join a new organization. I was at Beth Israel at this point and doing some subspecialty training, still planning on becoming a gastroenterologist full-time, but was recognized as somebody who knew a little bit about computers and a little bit about technology and software development. I was invited to join a new organization called the Center for Research and Education, a joint venture between Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital, one of the major teaching hospitals that the Harvard medical students use. So the center was supposed to develop research projects and opportunities for students while they were doing their clinical rotations at our hospital. At the same time, though, we recognized that we needed some funding to get that organization started. And myself and the then new director of this center, Mike Rosenblatt, and the president of the hospital, Mitch Rabkin, met with this gentleman, Carl Shapiro. And I bring him up today because maybe a lot of us, or this project or this area, wouldn't be here, at least myself, might not be here doing this if it wasn't for Mr. Shapiro. And in that meeting, when we were first starting this center, I was asked to kind of present your best stuff, give it a pitch, and see if we can impress him that this is something that he should help us out with. He was well known to be a philanthropist, a very successful businessman, and had already funded a few projects at the hospital. So I sat there with this gentleman who at the time was significantly older than I am, and he's still alive at 105 years old, and showed him what I then thought was a mock-up of a virtual patient, using PowerPoint and some of those activity buttons and hot buttons that you can create in PowerPoint to jump through the different decisions and jump to different places in the case as you would make decisions. And I think this impressed Carl, and the whole idea of the center impressed him. And right there in that same meeting, when I was showing my very first virtual patient to the very first audience, he wrote a check for $1 million. And that effect on me was that this is good. I can do technology and develop software, and I could probably buy some nice new computers with that. And even better, it was funding some real software developers and a real team to carry on this idea of the virtual patient. So while that funding went to other things at the center, and soon after that, we renamed the center to the Carl Shapiro Institute for Education and Research. And I give Carl a lot of credit, too, for insisting that we put the word education before the word research, because that's what he wanted the emphasis to be on. Well, brace yourself. This is the first real virtual patient that we made with 1990s user interface design. This is even shocking for me to look at, and it represents one of our first virtual patients, and I think I must have been inspired by this woman's choice in attire that day. It's bright colors and a lot of purple. It's a bit garish, but at the time, this was cool looking. But you'll notice there's components of this that are identical to what we use now. There's options on the left-hand side of the screen. You can obtain a history from her. You step through the process of interacting with a real patient. And in fact, she was a volunteer. This is a case on osteoporosis. She was a real patient with osteoporosis and was a terrific actress in this scenario. And you could even type in questions, something that still is not easy to do. We came up with a simplistic way to allow the students to ask the patient questions directly, and as long as you asked an appropriate and simple question, she had an answer for you. You'd step through the case, making some choices about laboratory testing, diagnostic testing, and then at the end, get feedback. This is Susan Greenspan, an expert in osteoporosis, who scripted and we videotaped her giving every possible feedback to every correct and every incorrect choice that she made. It was incredibly laborious. Susan was quite patient with us. She was clear that she did not ever want to do one of these again when we completed, but it was really a beautiful program that was used for many years with an expert giving feedback and individualized feedback based on what the learner chose or didn't choose in managing this patient with osteoporosis. In digging through my archives, I found some amusing media that soon after this and soon after we obtained another grant from the Macy Foundation to develop these virtual patients, the Boston Globe did a little feature about our virtual patient development and what some other schools were doing with technology. This is still pre-internet, or at least pre-widespread availability of internet. We were putting these on CD-ROMs and distributing them that way. But it was nice to get a little notoriety from the Boston Globe. I have to admit, no newspaper has featured me since then, but that was a nice start. I mentioned the Macy Foundation, which is another organization that contributed a lot to development of our early virtual patient software and the implementation of that software using our clinical experts. They enabled us with a $1.7 million grant to build a library of cases, and those 20 cases are still in use by Harvard medical students. Thankfully, they've been updated with their user interface and look a little bit more modern. But this organization did a lot to really get things jump-started in the early days, and we're still talking about the mid-90s or so. So back to the branch narrative, or this scenario of my life. I had after working a while at Harvard, it became clear that I wanted to pursue new things. I was going to need my own lab and have some control over software development and implementation and educating teachers. So I was invited to join the University of Pittsburgh, and with some time, a couple days a week, to have my own lab and some funding to bring in some real software developers and real instructional designers to enhance the educational programs, and not just virtual patients. We develop learning management systems and all kinds of tracking software and patient software. But I want to admit that I wasn't the only one doing this and the only one doing virtual patients and virtual scenarios. In parallel, unknown to me, people like Uno Fors were developing clinical scenarios that I later saw were very similar to the ones that we developed. This is one of his papers that he published, and along with Nabil Zeri developed WebSP, which these were developed completely in isolation. We knew nothing about each other, but the software, there's much prettier user interface. It parallels much of what the early virtual patient simulations did from Pittsburgh and from when I was at Harvard. And you ask the patient questions, she gives responses, and then you have some sort of assessment of what you were asking. Terry showed a similar screenshot from Labyrinth, which took this idea of asking patients questions and interviewing them one step further. It started doing branching, and branching down different paths and having scenarios that could change based on the learner's input, not just getting feedback, right or wrong answers, but actually seeing the outcome was a dramatic advance that the Labyrinth application did. And then other fancier things like 3D images and virtual worlds further enhance the user interface, but we still were at the, ask the patient questions, make decisions, see what happens approach to developing these cases. And that really is kind of the way doctors think. So if you were to break down how a medical professional approaches a patient and a patient problem, you collect a lot of input, and you collect physical exam information, historical information from the patient, and then you have to process that somehow, and that's where clinical reasoning comes in, and that processing results in making decisions about what's the most likely diagnosis, what additional testing do I need, what steps do I need to take to start to manage this patient, and those are the outputs, the diagnostic testing and the therapy that you apply to this patient. And that's pretty much the way a virtual scenario works, with a few more additions. So I want to make the point that it's important that there is a story tied to the learning. I think most of you that have developed virtual scenarios and virtual learning, and now we kind of take it for granted that these software and technology-based applications still have to have a traditional story tied to them. Usually it's a patient story, but it can be other things about the environment and activities that affect the patient's health. So that narrative kind of ties everything together, and a good story ties things together even better. But collecting clinical data, making a clinical decision, and observing the outcome is really the heart of what happens in a virtual patient case or any virtual scenario. What is added, though, is the dynamic feedback. Sometimes that feedback is just what happens to the patient. Does he get better? Does he get worse? Does he have complications? But also feedback from an expert and critique is an essential part. And in some of the surveys we did and some studies others have done, feedback is always rated as the most important part, the most valuable part that any learner experiences with this. And if you're good in the way you design it, you even design in some reflection to enable you to go beyond just that one linear single example and reflect on how that fits into your practice, how it fits into other knowledge, and then repeat it over again with other scenarios or other stages in the clinical scenario. And there's a reason why this works. There's a reason why students like it. This is how we all learn from the very earliest age. This child here is learning about how blocks work, and I suspect that one or two more blocks and he will learn that stacking them too high causes it to fall down. And as Terry mentioned, learning from mistakes can sometimes be more important than learning and being just taught the right way to do it. And interacting with your environment, trying things, observing the reaction is the way we all enjoy learning, and that's what virtual scenarios do differently than traditional ways of teaching. And this is how they kind of break down. And this is kind of the model we use to develop our VP Sim software, where there's the beginning of a story, some clinical data is presented. The learner has to collect some clinical data by interviewing the patient or by ordering diagnostic tests. And then he or she or they are required to make a decision. And at that decision, you can, basically three things can happen. You can choose the ideal option there in the center and have the ideal outcome. You can choose a poor option, which would perhaps have a bad outcome, and receive some feedback, correct your mistakes, and then go down the ideal path. Or it gives you the opportunity to have an alternative option, maybe one that's more focused on the needs of that particular patient, maybe one that is less expensive, more expensive, different side effects and such. So the branching narrative style of virtual patients offers a lot more flexibility than, say, just a linear one. And there's a reason why using these virtual patients does enhance the learning experience and the ability, and really the development of expertise. And a lot of that's based on the seminal work by Anders Ericsson, who demonstrated in violinists that the more you practice, the better you get. But it wasn't just more practice. And here he has lined up different levels of violinists from best, good teachers, and the ones that eventually became professionals had the steepest climb and and also achieved the highest level of proficiency and expertise. But that wasn't just from doing the same thing over and over again. You'll see, on the graph there, it's got 10,000, and there's a lot of people who wrote later about, oh, if you do anything 10,000 times, you become an expert. That's really not true. If you do anything, you have to do something maybe 10,000 times to become expert, but you need expert feedback and coaching and goal setting along the way. So this deliberate practice model from the original Ericsson article included more than just repetition. It included also focused goals and setting goals for learners, and usually it involved a teacher, an expert working alongside a mentor who helped the learner identify what his or her their goals are, and then provide feedback along the way. So these three components are essential, and I think essential components of any virtual scenario that you develop. I won't spend too much time on ubiquitous. Thankfully, Terry already highlighted the value of that, but this is a very important time when this organization pulled together a standard, but really pulled together the people. The important thing was that we made a XML-based standard to exchange cases between organizations and different software application, imported cases, and even handled the branch narrative type of cases. But in reflecting on this, it's probably the people that brought together. Many of you in here were involved with the development of the standard, which maybe not as used as much as we hoped when we put a lot of work into it, but I think it importantly brought together a lot of like-minded people who were doing similar things. So back to the branch narrative of my life. At this point, I thought it was time for the world to have commercial-grade software for virtual patient authoring, something that was easy to use, something that facilitated anybody who had an interest in creating branch narrative clinical scenarios for teaching purposes to be able to pick up the software and in a few minutes put together a constructive and valuable educational experience. And this is kind of what that early version looked like. Again, very similar to the other applications. Thankfully, I got over my purple phase and designed some a user interface that's a little bit more, a little easier on the eyes. But again, it's a patient story, some decision making, and then some results that emanate from that. As a gastroenterologist, we did quite a few on GI diseases, but created a nice library of cases at the University of Pittsburgh and thought it was time to let's make the software easy enough and available enough, make it all web-based, make it but easy user interface for anyone who wants to develop these. And here's the outcome after you make some decisions. And we added a few features, the ability to assign cost and assign scores and do track time, and also have the software make decisions based on how much money you've spent and how much time you've spent. And I'm being reminded about how much time I've spent up here. So, and this is what one of the branching narratives looks like that goes through a patient who needs screening for colonoscopy, screening for colon cancer and colonoscopy. So back to the branch diagram. So we had developed a really commercial grade software application within an academic institution and went through the laborious process of licensing that, forming a company, spent a year with lawyers and a lot of money with lawyers, eventually allowing the university allowing us to take this software and develop it into a product. That was one we called Decision Sim. And we went about trying to sell the product and bringing that to others. And as easy as the software was to use, it's still a complex process to create a good branching virtual patient. And granted, this is one of the more complicated ones. This is when Neil Benedict at our School of Pharmacy created this one, which has multiple outcomes, a dozen or more different outcomes based on the user's decision. So teaching this and training others to do complex scenario development became a bit of a challenge. And here's a few screenshots from virtual patient simulation with Decision Sim, the training course that we did. Another one, change the name, creating virtual patients, and change the background, decision making, or DSIM for learning and assessment, or creating simulations with Decision Sim. So it's years of training others, some more successful than others, but we brought in a lot of institutions, a lot of medical schools, the Veterans Administration, the people that take care of all of our veterans in the U.S., and really the largest healthcare organization in the U.S. adopted this in a big way. And the company went on to create some additional teaching materials and some additional features. We learned how providing data and feedback as to how individuals performed on these cases was extremely valuable, especially to leaders in business. Pharmaceutical companies became interested in finding out how their sales staff and how their internal staff would respond, and they started distributing these to thousands of people. The VA system also wanted to know how their doctors were doing in decision making. We even created a handheld or mobile device that could be used in an audience like this, where you all could make decisions about a patient that's projected up on the screen, and we could see in real time how those decisions affected the outcome of the patient. So that led on to bringing in investors, bringing in more customers, and that kind of changed things. This is what our kind of panel of customers looks like now. Large organizations, large hospital systems, pharmaceutical, commercial entities. It became clear that the time, effort, and cost of developing cases was significant. And in these organizations had the resources, had entire teams of instructional designers and writers and artists that could develop these cases on a regular basis. And so as Terry said, my focus then kind of shifted back to, well, what are we, where's the greatest need in virtual patients? And really not the software anymore, but rather the people and the effort. Just want to highlight a few, Terry, you'll see, is on this screen too. He already showed you some of the work that he's done, but we thought it was important that we provided some software to people who could really take off with it. Gary Tabus has created a series of over 100 cases for the Annals of Internal Medicine. It's the premier journal for internal medicine doctors in the States, and every month there's a new case that comes out, and these are well done. He created an entire infrastructure of the trainees writing cases, the faculty mentoring them on cases, and then publishing these in a professional way. Dmitry Babinchenko is a former employee of mine. I just have to mention that I brought him in early on in the development of virtual patients. He wrote most of the code for it, got interested in academics, having come from a business background, and decided to get his master's while working in my lab, then decided to become a faculty member in the School of Computing and Information, and just in the last couple of weeks defended his PhD thesis successfully, and used virtual patients as the basis for his research, looking at whether it was beneficial to use actual real clinical data from the electronic health record to generate virtual patient cases, and a study that I won't give away. He'll be publishing that data soon. But another good example. And the last example I want to show you is that Rosalind at the VA did, and she created a teach a van that went around the state of Ohio teaching clinicians using virtual patients. So you start out with a virtual patient scenario, but that van also had mannequins in it, or you could do a physical exam and even do diagnostic tests. And you go back and forth between the screen-based virtual patient and the mannequin and manage this patient for time, who you end up eventually figuring out that she has potential malignancy, and then get on a live connection with a standardized patient and communicate with this patient actor the bad news and get feedback directly on that. Rosalind Scott, just wonderful work with that, and that still continues to circle the state of Ohio teaching physicians. So here we are now. The branching scenario is a little bit complicated, a lot of diversions that I think actually made for a much more interesting path. And I guess I'm supposed to go to the midlife crisis next. I'm not sure if I'll have a few branches. As I shared with Terry, I did buy a sports car, but I'm still with my original wife. So, and hopefully I don't have to retire in Florida. So I just want to leave you with this quote from quite a long time ago, 1949. But it emphasizes kind of what I think that what the kind of work you're doing, the kind of work that we built the software for, is that learning takes place through the active behavior of the student. It's what he does that he learns, not what the teacher does. And this idea of active learning and engaging the student in activity, I think, is really what driving a lot of us. So I want to thank you, and thank you for your time, and look forward to meeting each of you and discussing any of this later.